Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk About Cannabis and Healthcare. I'm your host, Drudys Ledbetter. I am so glad you're here. And I wanted to just tell you a little bit story before we get into our sixth session. Since launching this series, our conversations have continued to evolve, and what began really as an opportunity to discover, hey, what do we need to know to move and integrate cannabis in healthcare has become a much broader exploration of healthcare itself, how we educate healthcare professionals, what we document, what we measure, and ultimately what healthcare must be able to see to provide safe, effective, and equitable care. So that's kind of the foundation of the Healthcare Visibility Initiative, which is what we're calling our movement now. It's really cannabis lends itself for us to explore a larger question. And it's really a question about clinical practice, education, and documentation, and patient safety. And really, how we care for people and how we provide for people is really important. It is really important for us to see the entire patient. I'm going to slow myself down because I'm going fast because I'm excited. I have a really great guest for you guys today. So I'm going to tell you that this conversation tonight is a perfect example of what the question that we're asking. How can healthcare care for a physiological system that many clinicians were never taught to understand? We know millions of patients are using cannabinoid products. And we also know these patients are navigating the healthcare system every single day. Yet most healthcare professionals completed their education with little or no formal instruction on the endocannabinoid system. So this conversation today is not about whether providers should recommend cannabis or not. It's about something much more foundational, like an understanding of the physiology that may influence the patients that we care for, some basic knowledge. And before we can really talk about and document and discuss cannabis in healthcare, we have to be able to learn and improve and understand firsthand the endocannabinoid system. So I am super excited to welcome a fellow nurse, Miss Meghan Zaklin, and I'm going to bring her to the stage as I do her introduction. Welcome, Meghan. I'm going to have clapping hands soon eventually. Meghan she earned her bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Merrimack University, and her master's of science in nursing from Simmons. Go Simmons. She brings more than a decade of clinical experience across integrative medicine, internal medicine, geriatrics, orthopedic care, serving patients both in inpatient and outpatient settings, while also holding clinical leadership positions throughout. Throughout her career, she has guided thousands of patients in the safe and effective use of medical cannabis, alongside conventional treatment plans. As part of the Mass General Brigham team, she serves as the endocannabinoid nurse specialist team that supports that group as they're navigating this complexity. So she combines her knowledge of lifestyle, body-mind medicine, holistic healthcare, really creating a personalized, patient-centered care experience that helps people achieve their goals. She also is bringing extensive experience in quality improvements because she is also the quality and safety officer for ECS Wellness. She's translated the latest evidence into safe, consistent, high-quality care in her own practice. She serves as the co-owner and chief quality and safety officer at ECS Wellness, a Mass General Brigham affiliated integrative medicine practice providing personal cannabinoid care and lifestyle medicine. She is also a passionate educator, helping clinicians better understand the endocannabinoid system in a growing modern healthcare way. Meghan, thank you so much for being with us. Before we begin our discussion, I know that you've prepared a short presentation to kind of help establish the foundation of today's conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And when we come back, hopefully we can explore a little bit about what you've shared with us, what we've learned about the endocannabinoid system, and we can go into a discussion of exactly what healthcare and where we need to begin to acquire this knowledge and talk a little bit about the news from the ANA National Assembly. The American Nurses Association National Assembly was last week, and we got some amazing updates. So I'm excited to welcome Meghan, and also to welcome her to share her presentation.
Thank you so much, Drudys. Thank you for this opportunity and all the work that you're doing. It's like time for us all to come together and support each other to support the patients.
No, absolutely. And this is so great. I thank you again for joining us at Canniversations, our brunch after NECAN, where we talked about the role of healthcare in repairing the equity gaps. And I think that was like the beginning of an amazing colleague friendship that we're building here, really just learning from each other, tapping in and sharing stories about what's going on in this industry all the time. Yeah. I'm going to pull up your presentation. I'm going to give you the stage and let you do your thing.
Thank you so much. And I really hope that for those of you that haven't ever heard of the endocannabinoid system, which I wouldn't be surprised that it's many, and it's okay. But hopefully you'll take away a little bit, and then we'll get into the conversation. So I like to start this at all of my presentations, whether it's to clinical colleagues, nurse practitioners, physicians, or RNs, with this food for thought. Have you ever heard about the endocannabinoid system before today? And I asked the audience, and I would say actually it's evolved over time, which is really quite exciting. Initially, it would be like a few hands up in the room, maybe eventually it would be a quarter. And most recently, I gave an educational CME to the Mass Coalition of Nurse Practitioners, and actually half of the audience raised their hand, which I was really impressed with. So we're getting there. And then the question, do you feel comfortable counseling your patients around cannabis? And most providers actually did not raise their hand in this recent talk. And then this is important. Do you discuss lifestyle medicine with your patients, or do you ever recommend meditation or mindfulness? So what is the endocannabinoid system? It is our body's quiet regulator at work in the background, keeping our physiology in balance. It's recognized and well described by clinicians in this field as a good way to remember it as relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect system. And it's really our body's master regulator. It's a complex cell signaling network that's highly expressed throughout the body. And it constantly adapts to both internal and external stimuli. Activation brings homeostasis to dysregulated systems. And it consists of endocannabinoids, receptors, the enzymes that break it down. And it's largely responsible for memory, mood, appetite, pain, and sleep. So we've developed at ECS Wellness this kind of mnemonic to remember what the ECS does. And we teach our patients, and I also teach colleagues, when you're evaluating a patient for any of these conditions, keeping the endocannabinoid system in mind is really essential, because that is the system that is in the background helping to regulate these. So when the ECS is modulated, that brings physiological homeostasis. But ECS disruption brings physiological imbalance. And so cannabinoid receptors are found throughout the body. CB1 in particular is found in the brain and the central nervous system. And then CB2 is found in the immune system and other organs throughout the body. They're both responsible for physiological effects. So when you activate the CB1 receptor, it results in decreased blood pressure, decreased anxiety, decreased intestinal inflammation. It can relieve depression, affects memory and appetite. And then CB2 receptors, on the other hand, activation there leads to decreased chronic pain, inflammation, decreased stress response. It can be neuroprotective, hepatoprotective, cardioprotective, affects appetite and metabolism, and affects bone health. So when we are looking at the brain and where the cannabinoid receptor, cannabinoid 1 receptor in particular, is expressed, it's largely expressed in all of these areas. And when you start thinking about cannabis and the physiological effect of THC in particular, it starts to make sense. So, for example, the hippocampus, it's very important for memory and learning facts. And a lot of patients that, maybe overconsume cannabis, or maybe don't even overconsume, just they're very sensitive to the physiological and psychological effect of cannabis, of THC in particular. That makes sense. It's targeting those cannabinoid 1 receptors. Where unsteady gait, cerebellum is responsible for motor control and coordination. Same thing. There's a lot of cannabinoid receptors there. But beneficially, the brainstem and spinal cord is important for the vomiting reflex and sensation of pain, and there's a large number of cannabinoid receptors along that area. So keeping the physiological and the physiology in mind of where the cannabinoid receptors are located is extremely important, especially when we're talking about cannabis and how it interacts with the human body and our patients and what their experience is. So it helps keep the nervous system and the immune system and gut systems in balance. ECS dysfunction may contribute to chronic pain, inflammation, mood disorders, and metabolic disease. There has been studies have shown that there's ECS involvement in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS, and ALS. And it may also play a role in anxiety, depression, irritable bowel syndrome, arthritis, and obesity. And then chronic conditions that are associated with ECS involvement. So when we look at pain and central sensitization, so migraines, fibromyalgia, neuropathic pain, IBS-related visceral pain, these are really complex and often hard to manage conditions. And there is ECS involvement. When we look at neuroinflammation and neurodegeneration, that's what I just touched upon. So multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, ALS, Huntington's. There's been studies that show that there is dysregulation within the endocannabinoid system, whether it be decreased signaling or decreased receptor availability in these conditions. We see it in mood and stress regulation, so anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, sleep dysregulation. And then when it comes to immune and metabolic disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, arthritis, obesity medicine, and metabolic syndrome, we're going to start seeing a lot of research coming out with how the ECS is involved and maybe potential targets for metabolic syndrome. And same with autoimmune conditions and chronic inflammatory conditions. And the most well-known triad of conditions was discussed by Ethan Russo in 2004. And it's this triad of irritable bowel syndrome, fibromyalgia, and migraines. And so in these conditions, it could have disruption of the way endocannabinoids are released, the enzymes and receptors that break them down. And that, that can lead to these type of conditions. And these are very difficult to treat. So a lot of patients that we see at ECS Wellness, they've maybe gone through the traditional routes, tried many different pharmaceuticals, tried other modalities, and it just quite wasn't enough to balance out their system. And then they end up finding us when they have either found medical cannabis already or read that it might be helpful for their condition. And I think it's important to understand, though, that cannabinoid care really should address the ECS and the endocannabinoid system, like wellness or overall tone. And when we talk about, how we approach patients at our practice, it's really, do they need ECS production modalities? Do they need phytocannabinoid supplementation? And if they need phytocannabinoid supplementation, that's when we're talking about cannabis, because cannabis is the herb that has the largest amount of phytocannabinoids available. ECS production modalities. So these are modalities that many of you may already be utilizing in your daily practice and not even realizing that there is ECS activity and you're tonifying and activating your endocannabinoid system. So yoga, physical activity, qigong, making sure you're getting restorative sleep. Various supplements can help support your endocannabinoid system. All the lifestyle medicine pillars, food as medicine, social connection, restorative sleep, physical movement, all of these help to support and tonify your endocannabinoid system, as well as other modalities that we see and we recommend all the time in integrative medicine, manual therapy, massage, acupuncture, teaching meditation and mindfulness. That's a very central part of our practice. Reiki, getting out in nature, aromatherapy, all of these things activate your endocannabinoid system and help your body to do what it's meant to do. So the endocannabinoid system, really, I like to describe it as a seesaw. It's always constantly adapting. And I already mentioned this, to internal and external stimuli. So if you are stressed out, your endocannabinoid system releases endocannabinoids on demand to try to balance you out. But sometimes our bodies can't produce enough cannabinoids to balance ourselves out, and we have a hard time getting to those production modalities. And they're essential, and we constantly are working on it. It's practice. That's why you initiate a meditation practice. You have a yoga practice. You exercise to work out your muscles and strengthen your muscles. And you can do that as well with the endocannabinoid system, as I just mentioned, but sometimes we need supplementation to assist so that we can get ourselves to that ability to produce our own endocannabinoids. So an example of that would be, a patient with chronic pain that really can't exercise routinely because of maybe they have a osteoarthritic knee, but they use a cannabis topical, or they take a little bit of CBD or a microdose of THC, and now all of a sudden their body feels better, their pain is reduced, and now they can do some of those production modalities, go for a walk or get out of the house to spend time with family members. So a lot of our patients that we see in our practice, and honestly, a lot of cannabis consumers, I would argue, there is something about this, combining supplementation so that they can assist with production. And really, when you combine those together, that's where you're really finding inner balance. But on the other hand, I've seen many patients through practice that production can also help decrease their need for supplementation. And that's a really important thing to educate our patients on. And what we do all day, every day in clinic, it's not just about cannabis. It's really focusing on the endocannabinoid system and what are all of our tools that we can use to help you stay in balance. I think it's important to talk about the timeline, and I'm not going to read all of these in depth, but it's important to talk about, the timeline of why I didn't learn about the endocannabinoid system in my undergrad. I was a biochemistry major. The endocannabinoid system is biochemistry. It's at the cellular level. The cannabinoid receptors are on the cell membrane. The endocannabinoids are produced from the lipid membrane and released on demand to send little quick burst messages between cells to upregulate, downregulate, based on what's going on within the body. So why did I not learn about this in cell biology? And why did I not learn about this during nurse practitioner school? And really, it's a relatively in the grand scheme of human physiology, it's a recent discovery. I mean, we were using cannabis as medicine. Those individuals back in the pre-20th century, in like the ancient 19th century in China and India and the Middle East. And then in the 1830s to 1890s, that's when Western physicians, we have knowledge of them starting to document use of cannabis tinctures for anesthesia, analgesic purposes and other medical purposes. And then it wasn't until 1940, though. So, I mean, how many years, 50 years later, that we finally isolate CBD from the plant. And then between the 1940s and 1950s, where there were ongoing efforts of ways and trying to characterize the constituents of cannabis, but the stereochemistry still remained unclear. It wasn't until the 1960s and 70s when Raphael Mechoulam, he was able to really isolate the chemical structure of CBD. And then Mechoulam and colleagues also the next year isolated the chemical structure of THC. And then by the late 60s to 70s, they were able to link THC and other cannabinoids to physiological effects. And that's when, fast forward, 16 years later, Alan Howlett's lab, they were able to create evidence to show that there were cannabinoid receptors in the brain. But it wasn't until 1988 that CB1 receptor was finally identified. And then throughout the early 1990s, that's when we discovered we were able to clone and express CB1 receptor. 1993 was when they discovered the cannabinoid 2 receptor, and that was really the birth of the ECS. And then it was this question of like, okay, so we have receptors in the brain and throughout the body. There must be some endogenous ligands or molecule that binds to those receptors. And then the hunt was on to find what those molecules were. And so it was in the early 1990s when AEA, or anandamide, which is named after the Sanskrit word for bliss, was isolated from brain tissue. And then back to Mechoulam, his lab isolated 2-AG, which is the other and actually more prominent endocannabinoid, in 1995. And at that point, researchers started to refer to the receptors and these endocannabinoids as the endocannabinoid system. And it was really like the discovery of what was in the cannabis plant, why was it working, why were people utilizing this medicinally, to hunt for why it works in the human body, that led to the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. But this wasn't until the 1990s. And so then in the late 1990s, we discovered the enzymes and really could describe the signaling concepts. And the early 2000s, we were able to finally map out the ECS involvement in its role as a homeostatic signaling network. And then again, what I already mentioned, Dr. Russo in 2004 had the clinical hypothesis around the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. And then after that, that's when we really started going into studying where the ECS was also dysregulated and how it related to clinical symptoms that we were seeing in patients. But you can see that like that was early 2000s. We're in 2026 now. So we have done some research but there's still so much to learn about the endocannabinoid system and how to really support it. But we have learned a lot despite cannabis prohibition, with the research has been continuing on with the endocannabinoid system, which I think is really important. But in the 2010s to 20s, the ECS was recognized as a broad lipid signaling network, and that it wasn't just about cannabis. And so, however, now we're here, 2026, and the endocannabinoid system still remains underrepresented in formal medical curricula. What was interesting, and I actually was excited to share with you today, Drudys, is I had a patient this afternoon who is at UMass Boston finishing up her bachelor's degree in psychology. And she learned about the endocannabinoid system today, and she said there's a whole other lesson next week on it. And I was like, what? Holy moly, I never learned about that. That's incredible. Great. You should be learning about this in school, right? So it's our clinical responsibility to learn about the endocannabinoid system. Earlier, or at the end of 2025, experts in this field, including Dr. Russo, he was one of the authors on this paper, developed medical cannabis competencies, including, number one is understanding the basics of the endocannabinoid system. And I always say to patients and I say to colleagues, it's like the ECS is the why behind cannabis. Forget the stigma and what your feeling is on cannabis. It is interacting with a physiological system that we have in our body. And it's important to understand what that is, and understand that, you don't have to understand the nitty gritty cell biology unless you're a researcher and looking to do that kind of work, or, a pharmacist looking to study and create medications for that. But it's important to understand that, and understand that there is a real reason why patients are utilizing cannabis and finding it helpful. And so in response to those competencies in the same journal in JAMA, one of my dear colleagues, Dr. Mehta, who is the medical director of the Benson Henry Institute for Mind Body Medicine at Mass General, has a opinion kind of describing our moral obligation for clinicians on why we need to learn about the endocannabinoid system and medical cannabis. And I love this quote: "Clinicians are increasingly confronted by patients using cannabis, often unsupervised and poorly informed. Patients rely on dispensary staffs, online forums, social media without reliable physician guidance. This disconnect compromises safety. It deepens inequities, it erodes trust. It is no longer defensible for clinicians to remain willfully ignorant." I think that says it all. So cannabis is Schedule 3 now. I mean, Trump already signed that. It is medicine. And what we see throughout the literature is that stigma is still a very real thing. This study from 2024 surveyed patients that were utilizing cannabis, and they were asked if their provider had asked them about it, or if they shared their consumption with their provider. And what they found is that 26% of these patients did say that their provider explicitly asked if they were using medical cannabis. And then 35% were like, well, I use cannabis. But only 4.8% documented in the EMR. It's a medicine. Why are we not documenting our medicine in our EMR? So my call to action to clinicians when I'm presenting to them is really consider asking all your adult patients during the medication reconciliation portion of the visit if they are utilizing cannabis as part of their treatment regimen. And it can be as simple like, many of my patients are utilizing cannabis and I'm finding, that they feel it's beneficial to their treatment regimen. Is this one of the tools that you utilize? And then consider adding medical cannabis use to the problem list so we can kind of highlight those patients, because unfortunately right now in our EMRs, we document an Epic. There is no way to document THC, CBG, CBD, any of these cannabinoids, what their doses are and their route, etc. And so it's really important for us to, kind of make that easy for patients and ask those open-ended questions and ask them like we would any other medication reconciliation. Do you take cannabis and what do you utilize it for? And really, do you consider it medical or recreational? Because right now in our EMR, it's part of the social history next to alcohol and cocaine use. So, if somebody is utilizing this medicinally, that's not an appropriate place to document it. And really, the route of consumption, what cannabinoids do you take, how often, and how many milligrams do you utilize daily? And that's part of the harm reduction and our responsibility as clinicians. And it's really like it starts with being aware of the stigma. And I know that some of your other presentations have gone through the history and reefer madness, and it's important for us to understand that's why we're here today, and we haven't advanced the science a bit further. So being mindful of that, it doesn't mean like shame on us, like we're here now, that's in the past. Let's move forward for the safety of the patients, and really just meet the patient where they're at. Ask if they're taking cannabis, and if they are, what I had just gone through. And then if your patient is younger than 25, try to like really counsel them and work with them. And that might be somebody that is you need a bit more nuanced support because their brain is still developing. So ideally, the cannabis use would be limited, like very minimal at that age. However, we just learned about the endocannabinoid system, right? So there might be conditions that are deficient in where their ECS is deficient, and we do need to supplement. So again, as a clinician, do not judge, try to figure out and get to the bottom of it. That's how we approach patients. We don't, we know the physiology, we know what interacts with the physiology, we know how to guide patients based on that. And that's really how we have to approach cannabis consumption as well. I always recommend to patients that edibles are the preferred route of administration, but that might not be the only route, and it may not be effective for them. And again, from a non-judgmental, we just don't have the research. I mean, I suspect that with pharmacogenetics, we're going to learn that there are gene types and genomes that really maybe edibles don't work for them. And that's where we're using the inhaled therapy. So again, it's not like, it can't just be like, stop. We have to understand. And if you are utilizing cannabis, it's really important to start low and go slow, because remember, you're interacting with a physiological system, and the ECS is a system that it always, if I keep going back to that seesaw, think of the seesaw. If you go one way too much, you got to go back the other way. You're always trying to get back to balance. So if you're constantly supplementing the system, especially particularly with these high doses, you're going to down regulate, because all of a sudden your ECS is like, great, I don't need to work. It's there. It's working for me. Somebody else is giving it to me. So keep that in mind. And this is where we can really educate and support our patients. Just like opioid doses can escalate, and then you get to a point where like, this is not going to give you any more benefit. The same thing can go, for cannabinoid doses, particularly THC. So that's when counseling patients, lowest potency flower, we prefer like a dry flower vaporizer if they are going to use the inhaled therapy route. Really try to avoid concentrates. However, there are patients that do really benefit from concentrates. So it doesn't mean that it's off the table. It's all about mindful consumption. And again, all the safety, avoid driving, store products safely, and monitor and advise against adverse effects in unregulated markets. You really shouldn't, and we can get into the repeal on the ballot for maybe not this talk, but anyway, they're try to avoid, getting it off the street. It's not regulated. It's not safe. We have no idea what's in that. And so it's a complicated medication. So if you are a provider, you can see there's only over 500 different compounds and over 144 phytocannabinoids. So THC and CBD are the most well known, but there are many other phytocannabinoids that we utilize every day in practice and patients are consuming and finding beneficial. Over 200 terpenes and flavonoids. And this is really speaks to the entourage effect. So, that's why the full plant is beneficial. And I think really like an ECS informed approach to patient care and, helping our patients navigate and cannabis is really like supporting them, but understanding the physiology behind it and honestly supporting their self and kind of coaching. It's like precision medicine, right? So like it's now a big thing where patients are using continuous glucose monitor devices, and they can see how their blood sugars react to certain food types. So you might say like, okay, the Dave seeded bread should be really healthy for me. Somebody, it is, their blood sugar doesn't spike, and then somebody eats the same thing and their blood sugar spikes to the roof. So it's really, we use these devices to track and see how our bodies respond. And I always encourage patients. That's why we start low and go slow, because we want to, like, a milligram might be enough. A milligram of THC might be enough. We don't really know how your body is going to respond to cannabis because it's interacting with a system that's already trying to self-regulate. So empowering the patient and partnering with the patient to have them utilize the medicine with our guided, dosing instructions and the way we start out, have them come back and report what they have felt and whether it helped or not helped. And then we go up to the next dose and we work together as a team. That is a harm reduction strategy. The lowest effective dose, it's like any other pharmaceutical. So really a decent number of your patients are utilizing cannabis, and that's why we're here having this conversation. But remember that, it can be a helpful integrative tool, but it's not the only thing. And it's important to consider production modalities prior to and alongside cannabis initiation. And really, despite what the patient thinks. And again, this is where, as we continue to educate colleagues about the various cannabinoids and how they interact, and you learn about the endocannabinoid system, that the THC, it's not all about THC. There's other cannabinoids that can be really physiologically helpful. And the other thing that's really important is that the whole plant is tolerated a lot better than some of these synthetic pharmaceuticals out there, because those are, especially like dronabinol, is just targeting the cannabinoid 1 receptor. Whereas the whole plant has other physiological properties and effects. And we find that patients we tolerate whole plant better than some of those synthetic pharmaceuticals. So yeah, that's the end of my slides.
No, absolutely. That was amazing. Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful overview. And I think that gave us a much better understanding of the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS, as we like to call it in the clinical world, and it actually raises kind of like today's visibility question, right? How can healthcare recognize what providers were never trained to see? And as I was thinking, as you're talking, most of us learned about like the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the endocrine system, the immune system, the nervous system, right? And most clinicians just simply weren't taught this. And now that we're seeing it more in education, I don't want to go back and talk about like how did this happen, because we know the racist history behind the villainization of the plant and removing it from its therapeutic use, that it had been used in the 1800s therapeutically. It used to be part of our pharmacopoeia here in the United States. But what has largely been absent from healthcare education in terms of like understanding the physiology, right? Because that's one thing, but connecting it to patient care is another.
Yeah.
So many people wonder why this matters so much and why we care so much. And I really believe it is a patient safety issue. It is an ethics issue if you're a provider and you're just willfully ignoring the endocannabinoid system with all the information and the data that we have out there. The bias cannot outweigh the science. And I've seen it in real time, like safety issues from non disclosure and patients not telling us. So, like as a clinician, where do you see the influence of the ECS showing up most often in patient care? You are caring for patients every day. Specifically, like how does this affect communication with patients? You talked a little bit about it in your presentation. How does it influence your assessment, your documentation, your clinical decision making? Um, because healthcare cannot assess safely something that has never been taught to even recognize. That's why I think that this is so important for us today. But go ahead, tell me, like, where do you see this in your everyday, and why is
Yeah.
it so important?
Yeah, I mean, well, and when we approach patients, especially like during the first visit, I always say, well, why are we called ECS Wellness? Because we approach conditions from the lens of the endocannabinoid system.
Mhm.
But what's so interesting is like, it's like it's not part of standard assessment. So I saw somebody today who I was doing her cannabinoid reconciliation, and she has a kind of arsenal of multiple products that she utilizes, and I was trying to understand what she uses, like takes for what symptoms, and she really does have that. She has like, for this type of pain I take this tincture 1-to-1, this kind of pain I take this. And then she kind of like stepped back and she's like, I really wish that like somebody could just tell me like take this many milligrams of CBD, this many milligrams of THC, blah blah blah, this product, this frequency. And what I was discovering and what I have discovered over the years in this field is like, and how I explained it to her is unfortunately, sure, we can have your general starting doses and kind of dosing range of various cannabinoids, but remember you're interacting with a physiological system that's constantly adapting. So I kind of we call it our canna blessing. I'm like, it's okay that you have 4 different products that you rotate and you kind of know what to go to for certain types of pain. Or she's a student, she's like, I can't utilize the THC during the day. I've tried it, just I can't focus. And there are dosing strategies around that because THC interacts with the cannabinoid 1 receptor. So sometimes for pain management purposes in particular, somebody might need some daytime THC. And so we would counsel her on that, but she does fine without. But again, it's like this blessing of like, okay, you're not just like chasing a feeling, so to speak. You're not trying to numb out. You really are treating a problem and a physiological disruption or dysregulation. And I think that her cannabis consumption is completely appropriate and it's completely patient-centered, right? So she knows okay, I woke up with a migraine today. This tincture always works for that migraine. And I know she knows her dose because she's slowly titrated it over time with our support. So I think it's really important as clinicians to remember, like, it's patients do have a lot of insight into how, and really encouraging that and supporting that of, they know their bodies. And I always say, like, your body better than I do. I know like the physiology, I've studied it. I know the medications that interact, and I know certain things to recommend, but I need your feedback. It's a partnership. And I think that that's where we really have success with our patients. And it's often like getting them to figure out their relationship with the plant. And once they have that toolbox, you're like, okay, we're going to put that toolbox. That's still working, but let's talk about, what do you do for, do you meditate? What are your stress reduction modalities? What do you do for exercise? Do you exercise at all? What are your social connections? It's like, so many people, especially we saw during the pandemic, like our practice was inundated because that pillar of lifestyle medicine went away. It was social connection. Like one of our like interventions to help people feel balanced went away. So keeping that is so important to keep in mind, that like these are maybe the reasons why people are utilizing cannabis.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that always comes to the forefront for me is the holistic approach to patient care. And when patients are seen and they feel understood, and they feel cared for, they're so much more open. And then when they don't feel judged, they disclose information that is absolutely critical to how we care for them. As a clinical leader, I've gone through a lot of like patient check-ins and checking in with their families. How's it going? How's the staff doing? And I will learn in 5 seconds something that the nurse didn't know because I asked really out of the box questions.
Yeah.
And it's always helpful to the staff. And I go, hey, by the way, this person also just lost their puppy and they could be grieving, and that could be impacting what's happening here in healthcare. And I think that those conversations are what make nursing so powerful and so beautiful, being able to connect with people on that level. But the thing that kind of stuck to me as, again, a clinical leader, because this has happened to me as well, is if I assess this, right? The ECS is not part of any documentation infrastructure. It's not part of how we operate in healthcare. Like you mentioned, the only place to document cannabis use is through addiction services. And then it triggers a slew of other things that the patient had no interest in engaging with, which then breaks that trust with the provider. And like, if healthcare can't safely assess what it was never taught, right? And clinicians can't document cannabis, if there's no safe place to document it, or it's not going to trigger a negative patient experience response. How do we handle our everyday? Because our everyday reality is that patients aren't waiting for healthcare to catch up. They're using CBD. They're using medical cannabis. They're using adult use products. How do clinicians and how should clinicians approach these conversations? In addition to the tips that you gave us, like if you're not interested in recommending cannabis, and this is not something that we're not saying go ahead and tell everyone to use cannabis, but in terms of like having the conversation with as much neutrality, what are some of the words and language that you've used? Because I think because we're starting from scratch, like even just the language in nursing school, we were scripted to death. We know exactly what to say for what, how to say it. We get scripted on hourly rounds. We get scripted on the 5 Ps, the 6, whatever, however many Ps we got now. We get scripted on everything. HCAPS rules the world. So how do we, like, what's the language that you're using with your patients that has been effective?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to particularly cannabis, it's first like, how do I say it? I'm like, how are you utilizing your cannabis these days? If it's a follow-up, or if it's initial patient, do you use cannabis? Have you taken cannabis before? And I think, I sit in, people are often coming to us like looking for cannabis, but not always. Some people, I mean, we're an integrative medicine practice. So but I think it starts with like just asking that question, if that's part of your toolkit, so to speak. And then from there, I think, clinicians, if you can kind of like armor yourself with certain things, like, if the patient is smoking, maybe like kind of inquire why. Maybe it is the only route that works for them, or maybe there is another reason, and just educating. It's just talking to patients. It's like the lungs are very fragile lung tissue, and there's a lot of good studies coming out. PAX just did a study that they found using a vaporizer reduced the harmful byproducts of cannabis smoking by 99%. So there are other ways to kind of, even just like your page handout, your smart phrase of like, if you are utilizing, inhaled therapy, maybe switch to a dry flower vaporizer. If you are utilizing CBD, there are some wonderful tools that do drug-drug interactions. So actually Up to Date does drug-drug interactions with CBD and THC and other cannabinoids. So we're always looking through that. We have a lot of complex patients with polypharmacy, oncology patients with all kinds of sorts of chemotherapy regimens and clinical trials. So they're Up to Date has it. And then Penn State has, let me get you the actual name. They have their own drug interaction tool, and it's called CANDIR, CANN-DIR. And you can really, because it's a cannabinoid drug interaction review. So you can utilize, any provider can utilize that. So we should really be just asking the question, CBD, THC, when it comes to amount, I really wouldn't focus so much on the milligram amount. I would focus more on, unless it's like super high dose THC CBD, then there might be more drug-drug interactions, but just ask the question, and if the patient doesn't know what they are consuming, that's an opportunity to have another conversation and say like, well, I really, it's interacting with your medications. And I'm not saying that I don't want you to utilize it. You're sharing that it's a very helpful tool to me, but I really would need to know, just so I can check for your safety, to make sure it's not interacting with any other medications that you're taking. And then really educating yourself with like the big ones that are concerning for drug-drug interaction. So warfarin, being aware of that, because CBD and THC can raise the therapeutic levels of warfarin. So if your INRs are all out of whack, just like take that little pearl and keep that with you. Drew has a nice story about that. Not nice story.
I know.
Just a very good learning story about that. And, the other pearl to always keep in mind as a clinician and a nurse is that CBD is actually the bigger culprit of drug-drug interaction. So, always, if they say CBD, go look up drug interactions. It's like in nursing school and at NP school, I remember so many times I heard, you don't have to know it all. You don't have to know it all. You just have to know where your resources are, and go look that up. And at ECS Wellness, we're happy to help any clinician throughout the country. Just come and ask us. And I've developed some patient education tools, some harm reduction tools. So that's definitely a very, I'm happy to share those with anyone. And then the other drug category that really there's a lot of interactions with cannabis is the immunosuppressants, the tacro. So any of your transplant patients, it doesn't mean that you can't take cannabis. It does mean you can't take CBD, but you can have THC. And it doesn't mean like with warfarin, doesn't mean you can't take cannabis. It's all about consistent dosing. I mean, remember in nursing school, it's like, if you're going to eat a green leafy vegetable, it's going to make your INR go up. But if you really like green leafy vegetables, then eat a cup of green leafy vegetables every day, and we're going to, adapt the warfarin dose to that. The same thing with cannabis.
Absolutely. I would agree. I mean, my warfarin story was very humbling, because been a nurse over 20 years, had been in the industry over 5 years, and I still did not know that. But that goes to show that you can be in the industry, you can be a patient, you can be a consumer. And as a clinician, you don't have the tools and you don't have the knowledge to kind of really support your patients. I mean, we've talked about this before. Certification doesn't automatically equal competency, right? There's a lot of certifying providers here in Massachusetts and provider systems that we've shared kind of like our stories of like how scary this can be. But you are a certifying provider here in Massachusetts, and we both fully understand that holistic approach and being authorized to do it doesn't mean that you're fully prepared. Talk to me about like the provider education journey and what true competency looks like when you're caring for patients using cannabinoids. One of the things that I just learned recently, and I also would like to add this resource, drugs.com. They also do the drug interactions. Yeah. Was that the CBD was the highest culprit, and CBD is not as regulated as THC. And we don't have labeling on any CBD products that says FYI or maybe, especially with the high risk, can interact. If you're taking warfarin, please consult your physician. If you're on an SSRI, please consider consulting your physician. I did not know about the immunosuppressants, but I think the big categories, there's over 400 drug interactions with CBD and THC. And it makes me think about like, okay, what else do we need to consider and think about, right? And I will say there's a visibility principle you just highlighted, and competency precedes implementation, right? Because you can't really do anything or implement this knowledge if you don't have like true competency. And this is something that we're kind of working on. And as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing that this conversation, sometimes it is bigger than cannabis. I mentioned the patient that was grieving her puppy. And I think about now how GLP-1s are so easily accessible online as well. And there's so many other things easily accessible, like ashwagandha, oil of oregano. People are taking holistic other medications. I think not only healthcare needs to kind of see human behaviors a little bit better, but I think as organizations begin to think about integrating cannabis in healthcare, we need to talk about educational visibility, which is kind of like a concept introduced in my book, Healthcare Cannot Manage What It Cannot See. And educational visibility is the idea that healthcare cannot recognize clinical information providers were never taught to identify. And as healthcare moves forwards, I think about just last week, where the American Nurses Association made such a monumental move. And I will shout out nurses, not just because we are nurses, but because we are literally the face of healthcare.
Yeah.
In the front lines, 70% of your caregivers are nursing professionals. Not only did the American Nurses Association, accept the proposal to acknowledge and accept LVNs and LPNs fully into the American Nurses Association. I always thought that separation was weird. I know some LPNs that could spin the block on some nurses I know too, especially like the old school LPNs.
My God,
they will stomp on these little new nurses. All day,
oh my gosh, the old school LPNs were what got me through as a new grad NP, like working in the nursing homes. It's like their experience. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, girl, go. No, this is what we doing. We are talking. It's the truth. And I think that it took so long like there's a little bit of this elitism in nursing. Like the more letters you have, the more certifications and it's really, there's something to be said about the information that you get from direct patient care and being in the building, being in the middle of things, watching. Like for me, again, I'm not in the front lines, I'm in leadership. So like watching how one simple thing can remove the tension from my staff. If it's a busy day, I don't do this often, but I'll order lunch, I'll order some pizzas. I know no one's going to get a time to get a real break because they care about the patients and they need to eat. So like a couple pizzas in the break room, grab a slice. Like nurses are barely going to the bathroom these days. So I like to think of like the future, right? Because right now, sometimes this is a little scary. And as we're thinking about the future, I like to think about, I say dream a little with me, right? And I dream a lot with my guests, but what infrastructure needs come first? Like what what educational standards, what clinical competencies, what has to happen? Like, what do we need documentation wise, referral pathways, quality oversight? Um, Patients are being urged to speak up and talk about their needs not being met in terms of their medication now that it's a Schedule III medication. And if you have a certified patient with medical cannabis as part of their clinical profile, they're coming in with expectations, and patients are educated. Are you going to be the facility that, is known for not knowing, or are you going to be like the pioneer that started looking at this earlier and started looking at the information? So dream a little, like what do we need to do from your perspective as a nurse practitioner, as a certifying provider, as an educator?
Yeah, I mean, oh my gosh, so many dreams. I mean, even so, just to become a certifying provider right now, you only have to take a 2-hour CME. And that includes the pharmacology of cannabinoids, route administration, et cetera. Kind of briefly what I touched upon. Indications and evidence base for qualifying conditions. So every state has their own list of qualifying conditions, and they're not standard across the country. Risk mitigation for psychiatric comorbidity, substance use history, pregnancy, lactation, adolescents, older adults. And then the legal and regulatory context of the program, including documentation and certification standards, which there aren't any.
Yeah, I'm aware. So I kid you not, like I went down this rabbit hole a couple of years ago because I was like, so where do we write it? How do we write it? What are the diagnoses? We have like 3 ICD codes. We can document cannabis use disorder. We can document cannabis dependency, and we can document cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, right? So if you think about the 3 things that we can document, none of them are positive, therapeutic.
Right.
So even if you have a positive and therapeutic conversation,
there's nowhere to put it. I mean, so we add medical cannabis use to the problem list, but it's actually the same Z code as medication adjustments. So you would use the same one as it's the same code with different letters, just depending on how you choose it, as like chronic anticoagulation or chronic.
So I love that.
Pulling reports as a leader, you're just like, oh, that Z code, I assume it's warfarin. They're on warfarin. It might be medical cannabis use.
No, that is so helpful because there's a few things that concern me when we're thinking about documentation. One of them is that we have the MIB, which is like the Medical Information Bureau, whatever, the insurance companies that all got together, and they basically share your medical information to either accept, prevent, or price your coverage. A lot of patients want to talk about it, but they don't want it documented on their, like, as a diagnosis, because that bureau only pulls like diagnosis and and they want to make sure that people are not avoiding disclosure to get more insurance benefits. I think that that's something that policy needs to tackle, and privacy and secondary use of medical information it needs to tackle. That's not, my mountain to die on. I think for healthcare, we need to, you talked about this just a little bit earlier, was harm reduction pathways. Every other harm reduction pathway, and let's talk about alcohol. Everybody hates when we talk about cannabis and alcohol, but I'm going to talk about it because every harm reduction pathway has social use, concerning use, dependence, and use disorder.
Yes.
We don't have anything on the other side of cannabis. We've only given it everything past the median point when it becomes dependence. So like clinicians are the governance of how we even talk about this. Clinicians are triggered to think of it as a negative thing. There's no documented acceptable social use, yet we have an entire adult use industry. And I'm going to lead into like our Massachusetts big issue right now, because it's a patient access issue. Patients and Project Destigmatize Healthcare, who also sponsored this episode, is doing a cannabis and healthcare experience survey this summer with Harvard School of Public Health in Massachusetts. And what we're finding in the early findings is that 79% of cannabis users that use local dispensaries are therapeutic use patients. They're telling us, I use it for this. And now we have a couple issues that come up. We have a workforce that's not equipped to handle medical patients and their needs. I remember the story you told me about the older woman with the that
I
was
know
upsold.
you're gonna go into
Oh
that.
my gosh, like that's a nightmare. You have an
Happened
80-year-old woman
again.
that is recommended on 5 milligrams, and the bartender is doing his best job at, getting that sale and upselling, and then completely ruins her care pathway. And I talked about this with the Cannabis Control Commission, a group from the Cannabis Control Commission medical program the other day, and I said, there's got to be a way. Like, I can't walk up to CVS and say, hey, I know my doctor sent a prescription for, antibiotics for 3 days, but I think I need 7. Like, I can't have that discussion with the pharmacy tech. They
Right.
cannot just change the recommendation. And I think that that's something that we need to arm our bartenders with education. They don't mean harm. They're really just they think they're helping folks, but we haven't given them the information or the education about homeostasis and low and slow. We continue to produce and sell high THC products, and then we are concerned or ignoring, I like to say, or not looking to the left at the uptick in cannabis hyperemesis syndrome.
Right.
Tufts University just put out their study last year about like this crazy uptick. I mean, I am calling the research department. I'm waiting for a call back, because you can't say 13-50% uptick when you don't have a baseline. Like we can't say it has raised from, and we didn't have established data where it was at. We have not collected enough data. And I think the other thing with cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, because it is real, it is happening, and it is highly associated with high THC products, is that we don't know where people are getting the products from. We don't know their use history. We don't know why they're used. We don't know what the product is. Maybe there is a type of product that is creating this. Maybe there is something in the product that we need to like remove from product. But that's like the CCC doesn't even have eyes on that to be able to regulate something that is creating a public health crisis essentially in the state. And we don't know, and they're all blaming adult use cannabis, right? Even though there is still a lot of smoke shops and a lot of online places where you can get illicit cannabis or illegal cannabis. And when I mean illegal, I don't mean the folks growing the plant in their house, right? I mean unregulated, untested, mislabeled Skittles cannabis, okay? Like the little kitty packages that you're not supposed to have. I'm talking about those products. So aren't we identifying in our, we're documenting CHS, but then that's it. CHS, yay. And like
there's so much that goes into that.
There's no like other, I think there needs to be like a drop down after, if you say CHS, there needs to be an assessment. Just like if you say you're a fall risk, there needs to be an assessment, and there needs to be interventions in place, and there needs to be education in place. And the other thing I think about often when patients are leaving is access in terms of med reconciliation. When we know we're sending someone home with a drug that needs a specialty pharmacy, like a compound pharmacy, we find the locations, we tell them where they are, we try to see if they deliver, we facilitate them getting access to the medications. And here in the state of Massachusetts, there's a ballot question that is threatening access to our medications. There is SAM, which is a group, a prohibitionist group out of Virginia, a bunch of billionaires, $20 million in a bank account, ready to like market the hell out of cannabis is bad for the next few months here in Massachusetts. And their argument is that it's bad for public health. And honestly, what's really bad for public health is not having patient access and not having visibility to what patients are consuming, and not understanding what product types are causing adverse reactions, if they are. That is harmful to public health. Not removing, like you can't remove every adult use dispensary in the state and think that these patients are just going to stop consuming. They're going to find a different way. And typically the different way is going to be untested, illegal, non-visible to anyone, not even healthcare or public health, cannabis consumption.
And even if they go to, if they become a medical cannabis patient, say that they do go that route, like I would argue that, we've been saying this for years in the practice, like it's a blank check. You can, like when you certify somebody most, like, our practice certifies based on medical necessity and when we want to see the patients back for follow-up. And the amount of pushback that we get from patients that come, find us, and have had their med card for years. Well, everyone else does a year and they give me this allotment. And it's like, yeah, but you're utilizing it medicinally. So they have access to 10 ounces in 60 days and they can just go and get whatever they want. So some of that, even the medical pathway might be actually harmful. But, that's where, to go back to your question of like competency, I don't think that that's a standard of care for certifying providers to really determine. They might just say, okay, well, this is the maximum I can do, and that's that. But like, they don't really work with their patients to understand why, or from what I've seen, at least from patients coming from different practices, like, to try to help them and counsel them on what they should be utilizing for their condition they're trying to treat. But there was an interesting study that came out. It was a survey study. They surveyed patients that had a diagnosis or suspected diagnosis of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and what they found is the time from starting cannabis consumption to development of CHF was significantly higher in those that were consuming the concentrates and vapes versus flower. And so we are starting to understand that, again, it's like, if you think of the endocannabinoid system, if you're always supplementing with high doses of what your body is supposed to do naturally, well, your body is not going to produce those cannabinoids naturally, and you're just going to downregulate the systems. And that's where all of these concerns and side effects come out.
Yeah.
I send patients to adult use all the time. There's one in my hometown that I argue is probably the most medicinal dispensary here on the North Shore. It's like, every patient comes out feeling good. It smells good in there. They have like aromatherapy going. It's clean. It's small. It's like the bud tenders are like, hey, welcome in. You just feel like you're in your hometown pharmacy when you go there. And then up the street in the next town over, our closest medical dispensary is like dark and dingy and scary. And the bud tenders are like grumpy and they don't help patients. And like, I have patients that refuse to go there. I'm like, I don't blame you. Like,
Yeah.
So
Well, that's because we neglected a little bit the medical program since adult use came up, because adult use is the moneymaker, right?
Yeah.
And I think in Massachusetts we have an opportunity to turn this around. I think the threat to our adult use industry is something we need to take seriously. And I think it's something that we all need to tell our patients to vote no in November, because as we're trying to adjust, as the data is coming in, losing visibility to an entire population of consumers. If you look at how many registered patients, we have about 120,000 registered patients in the state. First of all, we don't have enough providers to accommodate how many patients will flood in from the adult use market if that happens. So I am always recommending to my customers, my clients, and the hospitals I work with, get a group of people in here that can certify. And in your primary care practice, get somebody that can certify, because there's going to be a surge if this happens. I'm voting no in November. I'm telling everybody I know to vote no. So I'm going to speak that it won't happen, because I think it's really the most harmful ballot initiative for public health, patient access, and research. Now that we have more research capacity and opportunity, it is not the time to push away or close the doors to what we can see in over 80% of the patient population here in Massachusetts. It is absolutely irresponsible to even consider shutting down the adult use market. And I stand on that, because the patients are telling us they're using this as their CVS. As a patient, I don't go to a medical dispensary. I'm not a big fan. But also as a patient, I hate the fact that you can get your medical card on Groupon. Talk to me about that. Like, what kind of issues does that create for safety and for continuity of care?
That's the thing. It's just like when we focus on the card and that's the service being provided,
Mm.
That's not patient care. You're just giving access. You're giving a blank check to somebody at a discounted rate. And you know, we've said for years now, observing patients, and we started saying this really at the beginning. It's like those just coming for the card, they really are coming to feel better. And I would argue that, but um we are seeing, patients that really are coming, if they come to our practice for the card and we're trying to counsel them, we get a lot of pushback. It's the culture that we've kind of built. It's like, I know what I'm doing kind of thing, but it's like, but you didn't go to medical school. You didn't go to nursing
No,
school.
and
I
I'm gonna give you a different angle because I think as a woman of color, I have a different experience with cannabis socially. I've seen it around for a long time, and I was a DARE program child, so I was like, if you smoke, I don't want to hang out with you. And my mom was a pastor, so like she's still a pastor. So I was not the cannabis kid. But I also know that in certain communities, there is so much trauma, violence, and distress. And they don't know that they're consuming to achieve homeostasis, to ease their nervous system. So it's also important to, like, as we're talking to our young people, we're considering that there's a lot of trauma and distress, and also trying to help them balance and introduce them to CBD and introduce them to things that are not going to impact their growth and development, if that is something that they need. And that needs to be a medically guided experience. The other part of it is it's very cultural to smoke. Like people go to a sesh. I typically I don't like edibles in terms of gummies. I'll to have a good laffy like from Betty's Eddies. Those are great. But I prefer liquid. So Levia is my go-to. I do my tinctures, good vibes tinctures, Levia tinctures.
Yep.
I need it quickly. I need it in my system, and I need to know how much.
Yeah.
Because most cannabis that's intentional use is self-guided therapy.
Yes.
What happens when someone has been using it and they don't necessarily know why? I have people in my personal life who have been smoking since they were teenagers, and then as an adult, they're like, "Oh, my IBS doesn't bother me anymore." So like now they're intentional and they're paying attention, and they've been off IBS meds for 7 years. I have a colleague that had seizure disorder and didn't start smoking until like his 20s, and it was then like, I just realized I haven't had a seizure in 7 years, and I got off Keppra. Like what's going on? But there's been some people that smoke and need the medicine. So I think that there's an opportunity for us to say, where does cannabis and medicine intersect? Where's the balance? And for us to study the balance in these common situations. But we don't know what the common situations are because we're not talking to the people.
Right.
The common situations in one community is very different than the common situations in another community.
Yeah.
And I think part of the lens in communicating and talking to patients, especially those that were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, they don't want a medical professional policing their consumption. They want a partner if they have questions. They want someone not to judge them when they go into the hospital. They want to know if I broke my leg and I'm going to have surgery, that I should probably tell somebody, because I don't want to wake up. Like if those receptors are being taken up by my cannabis, my anesthesia may not hit the way it's supposed to, because these are, again, all over your body, in your nervous system, in your fingers, in your cells, in your brain. And I think our responsibility is to be just as aggressive and as loud and as public about cannabis education and the truth about the endocannabinoid system as we were about the DARE program, walking into schools and doing all these things. I am a big fan of Meghan from Athena Care.
Yeah.
Because she's in the high school. She's talking to
that is
them.
a power woman.
She is amazing, because as a mother, I want my children to know that this is not for you until this age. But if you need it, we can talk to someone and we can go get some directed care. But it's really hard. And parents with children with seizure disorders, or like autistic children that have been like sneaking CBD into like their regimen because they can't talk to their physicians about it. I think that is heartbreaking, and that is not the way healthcare was meant to work.
No, you're so right. It goes back to what I said. It's like meeting with a patient where they're at. And when people do say, I know what I'm doing, I trust that part of them does. And then it's our job as clinicians to kind of calculate the risk. And if we have concerns, it doesn't mean like no access or no, you can't do that. It's like, we wouldn't do that. How do we treat patients that are, consuming or over consuming alcohol? Like, we have a whole algorithm when they come into the hospital. We put them on CWA protocol. We monitor them safely. And it doesn't mean like, okay, go suffer, like we have to really do that. That's a harm reduction strategy as well for cannabis. And if, I've had such good results over the years of like meeting the patient where they're at, concerned about maybe they are like taking a higher THC dose than I feel is beneficial for them in the long run. But it's not, we don't talk about it during that first visit. We probably don't talk about it during the second visit. I'm developing a rapport with the patient and really trying to understand them as a human being and them as a person, them like what their medical needs are. And then it's slowly introducing other cannabinoids. And oftentimes I'm, just explaining the physiology and why CBD would be beneficial or why CBG would be beneficial. That gets them to purchase that. And then you'll see the THC dose start coming down. Like, I don't even have to have the conversation. They're feeling balanced. I mean, they're utilizing that entourage effect and they're like, oh, okay. I don't have, it's like, we say all the time to patients, it's not the behavior that's the problem. It's what's underneath the behavior. What's causing you to reach for something, to eat food compulsively, to drink alcohol compulsively, to exercise compulsively. Like, there's something, that's where we have to get to. Let's get to the root of the problem, and then the rest will follow suit.
Yeah, and I think it's important, especially for as healthcare providers, and as we're thinking about the change that needs to happen in healthcare, is just if you see cannabis use disorder or cannabis dependency or heavy cannabis use, like, don't make a judgment call. Mm-hmm. Don't ask questions. I think there's something about curiosity that makes nurses so much better, because it's that curiosity that leads us to the root cause. And you nailed it. And as we're thinking about closing this, again, championing nurses and thinking about how we're in the front line, I want to just give a kudos to the American Cannabis Nurses Association for putting together Dr. Deanna Summers and Lowlin and all the group that put together the recommendations that the American Nurses Association accepted. And we're going to have structured endocannabinoid and cannabis education for the 5 million nurses that are part of the American Nurses Association. And that is a step forward. And as an operational leader, I always wonder, okay, now we'll have educated nurses, but if our infrastructure and our systems and our policies and our storage guidelines and we don't have the backup for these educated nurses to thrive and really impact patient care, if we don't start building the infrastructure and we as leaders don't start stepping into the conversations within our organizations to say, all right, cannabis is here. Where is it showing up? How is it showing up? How can we document it? Where can we put it? How do we roll this out? How do we onboard our staff? How do we start education before 2027 and waiting for the ANA to do something? How do we tap into the resources at ECS Wellness? And how do we tap into the resources at McVernet Consulting? And kind of and I kind of put our stuff at the bottom here. Yeah. I'm going to just make sure people can see it, but it's really important to think about what that means and what it means for clinicians, that they have the resources and they have the ability to connect with us through our websites, through our services, and connect with us as clinicians to ask questions. I love having these conversations. I think today's conversation is a reminder that this isn't a cannabis only conversation. It's a conversation about healthcare preparedness. It's about whether our educational systems have evolved and will evolve alongside the patients that we're serving and the patients that we are seeing. Because healthcare can measure before it can document, before it can improve.
Right.
it must first be able to recognize. And that recognition begins with having the internal conversation. It really does. So as I'm beginning to close, I want to say, Meghan, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, for sharing your expertise, for sharing your time, your passion, for educating us and other healthcare professionals. I appreciate you being here. I'm thinking before I lead into like, I would say I was writing some notes and I want to kind of do a wrap up of the things we talked about for those folks who might just zoom up to the end. um, how can people find you? How can they work with you? Where is ECS Wellness located? How do they ask for you if they're part of the Mass General Brigham system?
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're physically located in Salem, but we do 100% virtual right now. So if you live in Massachusetts, or if you're just physically in Massachusetts at the time of a visit, we can see you. So we do have a lot of out-of-state residents that we will see in our clinic, particularly if they're getting their care at the MGH Cancer Center. We are an insurance-based practice, so we just treat the underlying condition and we bill insurance. So if you are a clinician in Massachusetts, or you are a patient, or you know of a loved one that's utilizing cannabis as part of their treatment regimen, we can see them. We take most major insurances, Mass Health and Medicare. And if you are within the MGB, we have a referral. You just type in ECS Wellness into the order, like your standard orders for any referral, and we come up. If you're part of the cancer center, any clinician, like physicians, nurse practitioner, nurses can put in an order, social work, nutrition sends a lot of patients our way. But there's actually an order set for supportive care services, part of the oncology clinic, and where there's a button that says cannabinoid therapeutics, and that comes to us. So that is another way to refer right through Epic, but you can book right online. We have online booking, or give us a call or text. There's many ways. Email, all the information is right on our website. And I'm on LinkedIn. So if you are looking to utilize my expertise and kind of ask me a bunch of questions, or again, as I mentioned during the presentation, if you're looking for patient education tools or harm reduction tools, let me know, because we have those all developed. I'm happy to share those with anyone.
No, that is so good. That is so good. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm gonna go ahead and kind of wrap us up. So a few key takeaways from today's conversation. First, education creates visibility, right? Because healthcare cannot recognize what providers weren't never taught. Like we need to do that. Second, competency precedes implementation. That was a nugget in magic. Like, if you don't have the competency, then you're not going to be able to implement this as a provider, as a caretaker, in a way that is useful to the patient. And I think as healthcare evolves, our knowledge must evolve, and we must evolve with our patients. So documentation needs to follow understanding, because we can't capture information. We have to know what we're looking for, what we're talking about. And honestly, patient safety is anchored in provider preparedness. And I think that that's really the other highlight that I got out of this, was that our providers can no longer look away. I do have the next episode is with a physician who is doing grand rounds in hospitals all over the nation, and really talking about our conversation. We share like the ethics of ignoring the endocannabinoid system, or letting your personal beliefs get in the way of patient care and safe care delivery. So I'm excited about that conversation, because the first 5 episodes of the series, we were really talking about, all right, cannabis, the history, the policies, all the other ecosystems that are adjusting fast because they're engaging with it, right? And then last week we went into like harm reduction, and we're like, oh wow, we don't really have a pathway for that. And then we went deeper into endocannabinoid therapeutics education and like the physiology. We had Justin from Cannabis and talk about research. And I think as we're moving forward, it's important, again, for nurses to lead the way. I think that that's critically important. We already have a recognized specialty in cannabis nursing that was recognized in 2023. We have standards of practice for frontline nurses and nurse practitioners. You can hold up your book, Megan, because we got it. That's
On
right.
Amazon.
Correct. The American Nurse Association, American Cannabis Nurse
Thank
Association.
you for
You
this.
can also find it through ANCC, our credentialing center. We are going to have education coming forward. And again, nurses have mandated CEU requirements. So why can't we just make one of those an endocannabinoid CEU, system CEU, and really start as people are renewing their license? That's another way for us to gather momentum and get that education out there, because our patients are not waiting for us. I'm really so grateful for this session, honestly, because it was a transition point, I think, for the series, where we start talking to providers about what exactly do we need, and people that are in this space and caring for patients. What do you need, and what conversations need to happen in your pharmacy and therapeutics committees, in your leadership committees, in your medical grand rounds and nursing grand rounds? How are you leveraging those spaces to bring this information to the forefront? Because as you mentioned, the stat, about 30% of our patients are actively consuming cannabis. This is not facts, it's fiction, it's data. We need to start preparing. So really, you bringing forth the point that, like, responsible cannabis integration begins with education, and really making the endocannabinoid system visible to healthcare professionals. Like, we're creating the foundation for safer documentation and safer decision making and safer care altogether. So I think that these conversations are critical, but also these continued conversations that we're having as providers. The endocannabinoid system is just one example of a much larger question at the heart of healthcare visibility, really. The question is, what information must healthcare providers be able to recognize? Not just the endocannabinoid system, but what else do you need to recognize and see to provide safe and effective and equitable care to your patients? And I think that that's why it's important, that, we're using cannabis as the first case study, because it's the perfect case study. But I think healthcare visibility is a broader genre of else are we missing that is impacting care. We have so much data. Why aren't we, like, cross-examining what else is happening as these industries are booming, as nootropics are coming up, as supplements and holistic therapies are, selling in the billions of dollars in the United States? Why aren't we concerned or talking about or wanting to see what people are actually doing? Why aren't we creating spaces for nurses to document them in the record? Why aren't we having conversations about early data? There's so many magnet hospitals that could be really taking this on as a process improvement and patient experience improvement. Because trust and believe, patients are going to start talking about cannabis in their age caps. They know, patients are educated. They know how to get your attention. I've seen it. I have seen it. And if you are not prepared for it, I'm telling you, I'm urging you, get prepared. Start having the conversations. So if today's episode made you think or sparked your curiosity, again, stay connected to us. Like, subscribe, share the episode, leave your thoughts. When this airs, we are in the comments in real time, answering questions, having conversations. But thank you for joining us. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And we'll see you next Thursday for another episode of Let's Talk About Cannabis and Healthcare. Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Drudys.
Yeah.